Hi, I'm Jeff Alex, host of Living Well with MS family of podcasts from Overcoming MS.
Hey everyone, Jack McNulty here. Welcome to another new and exciting season of Ask Jack, a special Living Well with MS podcast series. I'm excited and honored to answer food and cooking related questions from you, the Overcoming MS community.
To submit a question for future episodes of Ask Jack, please email us at podcast@overcomingms.org. That's podcast@overcomingms.org. Please check out this episode's show notes at overcomingms.org/podcast and dig into additional information and links on what we'll cover. And now, let's rev up our culinary curiosity and ask Jack. And have we got a meaty topic for you today? The episode's topic is meat replacements. Jack has carefully curated some questions around this topic, and we've solicited some directly from the OMS community. With summer around the corner, at least for those in the Northern Hemisphere, we expect people will be cleaning off their grills and readying them for action. But since research shows that meat is a no-fly zone for people with MS, how do you capture that texture and flavour without the negative health consequences? So thanks to Jack McNulty, we're about to get some answers. Happy to chat with you again, Jack. And how are you?
I'm doing great, Jeff. Thanks. It's certainly good to be back. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today and to answer as many questions as we possibly can get to about meat replacements.
And I think this does come up a lot, doesn't it? I think on other topics we've sort of touched on it, definitely, because it's questions that do arise very often.
Yeah, I was reading some studies earlier today as the billions of dollars that are just being poured into the industry worldwide in terms of creating these vegan meat replacements. It's really astounding how much money is going into it.
And and even if it's not a meat replacement as such, synthetic meat is another one that's coming up now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Which it's not, I mean, I don't want to sort of disparage this entirely because there's more than just our health on the line here. We're also talking about climate. We're talking about rainforest, deforestation.
Yeah, animal rights, those sorts of things.
So
exactly.
Yes, absolutely. And so, yeah, if people are going to eat meat, then if that can at least not affect the planet, then that's another benefit. We're not talking about that. We're being selfish and talking about ourselves.
That's right.
The health benefits. But yes, I don't want to say it's an evil thing. There's certainly benefits to not chopping down huge amounts of Amazon rainforest. So we've got an audience hungry for some advice on this episode's topic, so we'll dig right in. So Jack, some people can give up meat, but they really want the taste or the texture of meat. So are these meat replacements okay in general with people following the OMS program? And if someone does choose to use meat replacements, what should they be looking for in the ingredients? Is there specific ones they should avoid? Are there good go-to meat replacements they could use?
Yeah, I think meat replacements can have a positive role in an otherwise healthy OMS lifestyle and diet. Obviously, and pretty much like most everything else, there's a certain degree of personal responsibility involved, and that begins with a thorough understanding of a few things: ingredients, serving size, that sort of thing when you're purchasing something off the shelf in a supermarket. And I think that there's some reasonable factors to consider. For instance, if you're looking at the nutritional content in the labeling, I think one of the first places to look is the sodium content. Like any kind of processed or convenient type food, sodium is a big problem. And as we know from the wholesome studies that have been done, high salt intake is not necessarily a good thing for people with MS. It should be a lower sodium intake. And so I always look at the sodium amounts if I'm considering buying something off the shelf. I like to aim for, this is on a per serving basis, certainly anything less than 400 milligrams per serving. Now that's taking into consideration an otherwise healthy lifestyle and diet, which I do follow. And generally I have a very low sodium intake anyway. And so that's my top amount there per serving would be about 400 milligrams. I take a look at the saturated fat. Obviously, that's a big consideration for anybody following the OMS program. And so for me, again, if anything is less than, say, 2 grams per serving, I'm generally okay with that. And that's, again, with the caveat that that's for someone that's following an otherwise healthy lifestyle and diet, where your saturated fat intake is relatively low. Fiber is another thing to consider. Most of these products are pretty low in fiber. A lot of that's been stripped out. Some of them are better than others. I like to try to find something that's going to be greater than 4 grams. I think it's also important to understand that a lot of times, because this is a protein replacement in the diet, and a lot of times you're replacing fiber-rich foods in your diet with something like a meat replacer. You're not eating your tempeh or legumes or lentils or something of this nature and replacing it with something else that's going to be much lower in fiber. And so I take that into consideration. So if I do that, I either combine it with something that's fiber-rich, or I choose a product that's going to have a higher amount of fiber in the first place. That's just something to consider. I also take a look at binders and emulsifiers. Now, these are common ingredients in any kind of meat replacer or any sort of convenient product. The problem is there's not a lot of information that's been done, not a whole lot on the scientific side anyway, that I can find that states whether these products that are being used are, what's the long-term ramification for human health? That question is still out there. So while that's dangling, I tend to say maybe my intake should be a little bit less in that particular area. So that's certainly a driving force in any decision I'm going to make. The lower amounts of those binders and emulsifiers, the better. I think it's also important to understand that meat replacements can work as a pretty good transition for some. So, some people that are new to the lifestyle, they're going to be coming basically to the program or possibly with a meat-centric, dairy-centric, convenience food-centric kind of diet. And to change that from that to going into something full-blown plant-based that's going to be fiber-rich, that's going to create some problems. That's going to create some digestive problems. That's going to create some bloating in the system and that sort of thing. And it's really recommended that the transition to help your microbiome should be, 3 to 6 months, that sort of time frame, in smaller portions as you ramp up. As far as the information I've been able to find. And so, during this phase, sometimes these meat replacements really work as a nice transitional product to help sort of get you on the right path towards plant-based. When you do have a lot of problems and you switch over to a plant-based diet and you have this bloating and discomfort, that is a put-off to a lot of people. And they kind of walk away from the diet and say, oh, I don't want to do this sort of thing because it makes me uncomfortable. Understandably so, but maybe it's just you need to allow for a little bit of time and to transition into it. I think the bottom line really, Jeff, it's not a meat replacement diet we're talking about. You have to look at this more in micro terms. It's more of a single-use kind of replacement. It works sometimes, especially if you're looking at products that have acceptable levels of sodium, saturated fat, fiber, use minimal amounts of binders and emulsifiers. That's probably going to be okay when viewed in the context of an otherwise healthy diet.
Are we talking, when we say meat replacements here, we're talking about things like, to use the trade names, the Beyond Meat burger.
Exactly. Yes.
Well, we're not talking about soy, seitan, those sort of single.
No, not necessarily. Although some of those products are used in a convenience matter.
Yes.
You know, you have to just imagine walking into a grocery store, and every time I go into a grocery store, I look at the expanding array of offerings in the vegan section, which once used to be sort of in the corner of the supermarket. Now it's pretty prominent, and it's growing. Mm-hmm. And so if you look at those things, and you see sausages, you see schnitzel, you see the Beyond Meat products, the cheeses, the vegan butters, and on and on. It's basically all kinds of foods that are being replaced, just more on the convenient side. That's what I'm talking about.
And I would say, actually, from looking through those fairly extensively, the majority are not healthy on an OMS diet.
That's right. If you look at the sodium, saturated fat, and fiber, that's going to eliminate 75-80% of the products available today anyway.
Yeah.
So that's a very good way to just sort of weed out all of the things that aren't going to work for us. Just look at those three things. That's usually going to be enough.
It is possible to find some things. I mean, I have to say, there was one recently I found. It was actually in the frozen vegan section. They had veggie burgers, which, even veggie burgers, we thought the oldest, really, if you think the original vegan burger from back in the 60s, 70s, mostly those contain huge amounts of ingredients, probably a lot of oils. But actually, there was one that I found which was really good. It was basically vegetables, and because it was frozen, they weren't worried about things to prolong its life. And actually, it was sort of held together because it was frozen. So you could grill it from frozen, and the numbers were all good. And actually, I thought, okay, there's a number of ingredients; they're all vegetables. So if I'm going to eat a fast food burger, that would be a convenient food that I think actually there's not too much wrong with that one.
That's right. And I'm as a chef, I'm just naturally curious about a lot of things anyway. I'm curious about making things myself, but I'm also curious about what's going on in this space. Are some of these things really worth it? And as an example, just a couple of days ago, I was in there and I saw a new product that was basically a schnitzel that was made out of pea protein and that sort of thing. It fits within the guidelines of OMS, right? And the sodium content was relatively low, and all of these factors I considered, and I thought, what the heck, I'm going to just try it and see how it is. And I came home and I prepared it and ate it, and I was just highly disappointed. I mean, the breading fell off, the texture wasn't right, the flavor wasn't there, and so I thought, I can do this better myself using a kohlrabi schnitzel or a celeriac schnitzel or something like this. That's way better than something that's purchased off the shelf. So many times that's going to occur as well.
And I think we mentioned taste and texture. And I think that's important as well, because if you were to eat a burger from McDonald's, Burger King, Wendy's, Five Guys, wherever, certainly the basic burger from a McDonald's or Burger King, I don't think it would be very pleasant on its own. Not unpleasant. It just wouldn't taste of an awful lot. The flavour is coming from the other stuff that's in with the burger. Their sauce, the vegetables, the salad, that's where the flavour comes from. The
fat also, yeah.
Yeah, so actually, we can still do the elements that make a burger nice. We can add a nice sauce. We can add tomato, we can add lettuce, we can add all these things, and some pickles and whatever, all fine. And then it's the texture. So it's not just taste. It's and actually a lot of things like a burger may not have much taste. There's not an awful lot of taste to chicken. There's not an awful lot of taste to a basic burger. A lot of these things don't have a lot of taste, and they're just vehicles, really. But it's got that chew, and that's really what we're aiming for. Is the chewiness.
That's right. We've become very used to the idea of meat in our food that has a certain mouthfeel, that has a certain texture, that has this sort of umami type taste that comes from the cooking of the meat, which is the denatured proteins. So these are the things that if you just break it down and look at that, you can think of ways, can I replace that in a healthier way without having to turn to that meat or without having to turn to some factory produced product? And that really becomes kind of the key or the crux. And I think that it's far more important to develop kind of this sort of excellent eating and cooking habit, or this understanding of ingredients, than it is to worry much about, how am I going to replace meat in this recipe that's calling for, ground beef or something like that. There's tons of ways to do that. It's just that we have to get beyond that barrier. We have to move beyond that mindset of, oh, it needs to taste a certain way. It needs, the texture has to be exactly like this, and et cetera, et cetera. We can get it close in a plant-based world. It's never going to be 100% the same. But my question is does it really need to be? It's all part of an expanding sort of viewpoint or way of looking at how we eat.
Yeah, and one thing I want to bring up is to get that texture. Sometimes just not overcooking vegetables is one of them, because there's a meal that I've been having recently, which I was mentioning to you earlier. Actually, I think the Indonesian meal is nasi goreng. It's a rice-based meal. So basically, a rice-based meal. It's got a lot of flavour from chili and a nut butter. I think originally it would be peanut butter, but I use almond butter, which is actually quite easy to make yourself from almonds, and nothing else but almonds. So it's relatively high saturated fat because nuts are, but a small amount of that. And then not overcooking vegetables. So asparagus goes in there, tender stem broccoli, but they literally go in at the end of the cooking process. So there's a lot of there's chewiness, there's crunchiness from that, and there's flavour from the chilies and the almond butter and soy sauce and so on. But it has everything you need, really. It doesn't lack. For you don't think, oh, this would be nicer with some chicken. It's exactly. A meal of itself that doesn't think, oh, actually you've just given me a meal without the meat. It's like, no, this is just a meal.
Yeah, and if you can look at eating as a way to just please multiple senses, then you can be quite happy having something that has just many different flavors and tastes, and and something that's crunchy, so you get that feel of different texture, and something that has a lot of aroma, and you're just playing with all of these different senses to create sort of a wonderful experience, and it doesn't necessarily need to have meat to do that, and it certainly doesn't need to have a meat replacer to do that as well.
And so mentioned, so we were talking about meat replacements in the sort of commercial side of it, but there are also more closer to natural ingredients. So do you have any good ideas for creating meat-like OMS-friendly food with things like tofu and seitan?
Yeah, I think the most important thing to consider when you're creating meat-like preparations using various ingredients such as tofu, seitan, I'd throw tempeh into that mix, or ground up mushrooms, or these sorts of things. Jackfruit is another a very good meat kind of substitute. I think the keys here are to create umami and to create texture. And there's some tricks to doing this sort of stuff. So let me just give you some ideas. To create umami, the ingredients I like to use to create this sort of taste is things like yeast extract, which a lot of people would call Marmite. It's very similar to that. The yeast extract that I would get here in Switzerland is a German product that's just basically a yeast extract. I know Marmite has some other things that go into it, but basically it works the same. I think soy sauce, tamari, and liquid aminos are fantastic to use. And if you use those in combination with a vinegar, specifically like a brown rice vinegar or a Chinese black rice vinegar, which is fantastic, or even a balsamic vinegar. If you use the soy sauce tamari mixture and a vinegar in combination, it creates a lot of umami, and it works wonderfully when you're working it into ingredients. Powdered mushrooms are another thing that I like to use quite a lot, and so you can buy powdered mushrooms, but I think it's just really simple to just go buy some dried mushrooms. I like shiitake or porcini are the two that I would use the most. You just bring them home. I have a coffee grinder, so I pop them in the coffee grinder and I just grind them. And then I use that powdered mushroom as a seasoning. So I cut back on sodium and I'm increasing the umami by doing that. It's a wonderful way to bring additional flavor in. Of course, white and yellow miso also work wonderfully to bring that sort of umami, that meatiness into a dish. And liquid smoke, which I think we've talked about on the podcast before. And again, liquid smoke is, will introduce a sort of a hickory or charred flavor to food. You do have to be a little bit careful. Not all liquid smokes are healthy, but there are some that are quite good that basically just have water and the aroma that's been extracted. So it's perfectly healthy. There's nothing unhealthy about it. And you're just using a couple of drops to create a big punch of flavor. In terms of texture, so tofu and seitan come to mind as things that you can play around with texture. So tofu, I find, is excellent, and especially if you can do a couple of things with tofu. So I'm talking about firm tofu, not something that's going to be really soft, but a really firm tofu. And so you unpack it, you drain it, you can pat it dry, cut it up in little chunks. And one thing that I found that works really, really great is bring a little pot of water to a boil and then salt it and give it a good amount of salt. It should taste a little bit like the sea. And once it comes to a boil and you've salted the water, put your tofu in there and boil it for about 3 minutes. And then just let that cool in the liquid for about 15 minutes off the heat. Drain it, take those tofu pieces, put it out on a towel, and just let it come to room temperature. Ideally, you'd want to do this a day in advance and put it in the refrigerator. And it turns into sort of this sort of a spongy consistency that's very similar to paneer, and it works great in curry dishes. So it's going to give you a really fantastic sort of experience in a curry dish.
So I just wanted to go into a bit more about what these things actually are. So tofu is entirely made of soybeans, yeah?
That's correct, yeah.
So
it's basically, it comes from soya milk. So it's made from soya milk.
So I was going to get on to that, but there is... So is there a concern? Because I know that some soybeans are very genetically engineered, genetically modified, and there's risks of soy, isn't there? So are you careful, with, or do you worry about having too much tofu because of too much soy that might have? There's all sorts of things, isn't there? Like potential hormones.
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion in the world, and without having to go into too much detail, maybe we just talk about soya as a whole nother podcast.
Well, yeah,
but a lot of people do have concerns about it. But then on the other hand, there's a lot of well-respected doctors, nutritionists, et cetera, that are out there that really put those concerns to rest. I think the most important thing with soya and soya products is to make sure that you're purchasing something that's not from genetically altered soybeans,
right?
Which is increasingly difficult to do, but not impossible, and you can find that relatively simple.
Like you said, I think there is a whole episode on soy because I've got loads of questions. Tempeh, tempeh, is that still soy, but has some of the beans?
It is. Tempeh can be made with a number of different whole beans, but it's typically made from soya. So it originates from Indonesia, and basically it's just the whole bean that's been cooked, and then it's inoculated with a mold. It sounds great at this point. And then it's just allowed to age. That's why when you have it, it's compressed and it has that sort of whiteness around it. That's actually just the mold.
And seitan then, as a quick definition of that?
Yeah, so seitan is basically 100% gluten. So it's the gluten that's been removed from a wheat kernel, and the starch has been washed away from it. And what you're left with is just pretty much 100% protein. And that can be utilized to create meat-like substances by combining the dry ingredient, the gluten itself, sometimes with another kind of flour like a chickpea flour, with an umami-rich liquid, or sometimes even ground up tofu or blitzed up tofu. But basically, you're going to have a lot of soya in it, soy sauce or tamari, that sort of thing. Aminos work well, and a lot of heavy flavoring. And then what's critical then is to think about it in terms of making a bread. So as you're kneading the seitan, the more you knead it, the firmer it becomes as an end product. So if you want to create something relatively soft, you just basically mix those ingredients together and don't knead it at all.
So seitan is something you would typically make it yourself, rather than...
Not necessarily. You can buy a lot of seitan products. Personally, I find it's really simple to work with. It's really not difficult to make it. And we can put some instructions up in the show notes to do that. But there's lots of variables. And so once you get everything mixed together, then you have to pre-cook it. And so you can steam it, you can cook it in the oven, you can boil it. All of these things have an influence on how the end product or the texture is going to be. And of course, however much flavor you put into it, and whatever liquid you're cooking it into, the more flavorful, the better, and that's going to have an influence on how it tastes in the end. But you can literally prepare a roast, prepare something that looks like a sliced turkey breast or something like this. You can prepare, meatballs. You can make burgers with it. There's just so many different ways to think about it. And it's an ancient technique. And this goes back thousands of years to the ancient Chinese and Japanese that figured out how to do this.
But would that have gluten in it, presumably?
It's pretty, quite a lot. So this is
if we're
definitely
not having gluten,
for someone.
So seitan, good for protein?
Excellent for protein, not so good if you're watching your gluten intake.
Right, so that ticks the boxes, but not gluten. Tofu, we're avoiding genetically modified, but good for protein.
Yeah, excellent for protein, exactly. And I was mentioning you can boil it. There's another technique to change the texture, and that's freezing it. So if you freeze a block of tofu and then defrost that and let it come to room temperature, you'll find that the texture has completely changed. It has firmed up. And in the internal bit, if you cut into it, is very spongy. And so it's going to readily absorb flavor. But what's interesting is if you cook it, especially if you cook it in a liquid, it will hold its shape much better than if you didn't freeze it beforehand. And so that's just a technique to change a little bit the texture of using something like tofu.
And is it worth getting a tofu press, do you think, to remove? I mean, I see a lot of these things where they say they try and remove as much water. You can certainly buy it now in lots of different forms. Silk and tofu.
I don't know. I use a double paper towel in the palms of my hand.
Okay,
that's my tofu
works
brush. I don't get too. I know a lot of recipes say, you got to get out as much water as possible. But I found that, if you get out the surface bits, and especially then if you cut it and then press it again once it's cut, you're going to get out enough, and it's not going to have a huge impact. That's my experience as a cook discussing that.
And just to mention, you touched on jackfruit as well. That one, it's just a single vegetable product, but that's low protein, isn't it? So I
believe
that,
so. I'd have to check the nutritional content.
I'm fairly sure that one doesn't tick the protein box, but it does tick the other boxes. So
and and people have made a lot of different things with jackfruit. So taco filling, burrito filling, that sort of stuff. Mixing it with barbecue sauce, and you can come up with some really interesting. I use it to make a bolognese, which is fantastic, and it works great in that environment. Another thing you can do is just take an oyster mushroom. Just a normal raw oyster mushroom. If you can envision this, take a fork and just run the fork along the oyster mushroom, and it will break up into strands. And then if you cook that in some kind of tomato-based sauce or barbecue sauce or something like that, you can really, once it's cooked and then working it into the sauce, you can really create something that's going to be like a pulled pork or something of that nature. It's really fascinating what you can do with mushrooms.
That's one actually that is in the vegan area of my local supermarket. They do a pulled mushroom. I didn't realise you could do it easily with a fork.
Give that a try. It's really fascinating. It just kind of pulls apart in strands. It's really, you don't even need to use a fork. Sometimes I just peel it with my hand. It's pretty easy to do.
So we've talked quite a bit about burgers. What would be your absolute go-to recipe for a veggie burger? What would you do if we're getting into sort of hopefully the summer season in the Northern Hemisphere, and you want something to stick on a barbecue, or you want to create a burger? What would be
as I like to say, there is, as a good American would always say, there is no season for a burger. That's all year long. Let me give you two ideas. So the very, very simple idea, you can get like a portobello mushroom, which is like in essence, a giant chestnut kind of mushroom. You can cut off the stem, just work it in and marinate it in a mixture of soy sauce and vinegar, like I said earlier, and then just wipe it off on a nice oiled grate of a grill and just grill it, and just use that as your burger. So there's no need to really form anything else. It itself has the shape of a burger. And then just put it, between two slices of some kind of nice whole wheat bun or something like that. I usually do that with a guacamole and a slice of tomato in there and maybe some kind of chili to spice things up a bit. And it's delicious. That's just a really simple way to do something that tastes quite meaty, surprisingly meaty. But if I were to make my own, and I'll put this recipe up in the show notes, I use a combination of ingredients. So it seems at first like, oh my goodness, this is a lot of ingredients, but they're all doing something. And so I use cooked black beans, black rice, and chopped brown mushrooms. So that's the protein base. The chopped brown mushrooms are just like chestnut mushrooms, black rice, and the cooked black beans. I get all of that, I puree together. Then to give it a little bit of texture, I'm using ground walnuts and a half a beetroot that's just grated up. Then I start working in my umami flavors now. And so I use, in addition to herbs and spices, I'm going to use a little bit of miso, usually like a white or a yellow miso, which is a little bit milder. I use soy sauce and balsamic vinegar. And to bind it all together, I would just use chickpea flour, which works great as a binder. And then sometimes I do add a little bit of liquid smoke into the mixture. I just formulate it into burgers. And then what's really important is I refrigerate it. And I refrigerate it for at least a couple of hours. So this is something you can actually do a day in advance. And then you can put it directly on the grill. It functions exactly like a burger would function. And the texture is surprisingly close to a burger.
And chickpea flour, you mentioned, that's the same as gram flour, isn't it?
Yeah,
Same
exactly.
Thing.
Yeah. I think that's about as far as I go with burgers. I mean, once I came up with that particular idea and recipe, I just thought, well, there's no reason to develop further. I'm quite happy with that one. That and the combination of the portobello mushroom with a guacamole or something, which is my wife's favorite. So that's usually the one that we go with.
And you were saying putting it in the fridge. I actually quite like freezing them as well, because firstly they hold together if they're frozen, but also just because then it becomes a fast food.
Exactly.
It's as easy to make 6 as it is to make 1. So
that's right. And you can use that same mixture because everything is already cooked. So you can use it, and instead of creating a burger, you can create little meatballs and throw it into your favorite pasta dish or something of that nature. So you're right. Freezing is a great way to do.
I think because a lot of whole food cooking is more labor intensive, and so I think freezing is a good way of saying, actually, let's rather than making every single meal from scratch, it is more labor intensive than buying ready prepared meals. But if we can make them and then freeze 50%, then suddenly we've got an easy to cook meal for next week that we don't have to cook everything from scratch, because actually, and freezing, for a couple of weeks, if not a month or more, it retains a lot of the nutrition, doesn't it? And as you said, actually, things like tofu can actually be improved in some ways by freezing.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And I think obviously things like sometimes a chili or something like that can actually taste better reheated. I don't know why.
Oh yeah, definitely.
I don't know what's happening
I
there.
Totally agree. Totally agree on that.
So to move on to some of the specific questions from members of the global OMS community, there's 2 particular questions. I'm going to ask both of them because they're related. So Linda from Germany has taken to using soy crumbles, which have to be rehydrated, making them like chicken or meat. And so she wants to know if they're okay or are they too processed. But also we had Vicky from the US has another soy question, and she's curious about your take on soy curls. She's not sure if you can access them everywhere. I've certainly not come across them. But her understanding is that they're extruded and dehydrated soybeans.
Yeah.
So she was asking, could you explain the difference between soy curls and TVP or textured vegetable protein?
Yeah.
But so both these things sound quite similar. So soy crumbles, soy curls, are they similar things, and are they
similar in the sense that they generally use soya, and that's about where it stops.
Okay, they are quite different, are they? Okay.
So soy curls, did you say you came across those already?
No, I haven't come across soy curls.
Yeah.
But
I think it's more of an American thing at this point. It's a company in America that's developed it, and it's basically using the whole soya bean. And so the soybean is cooked, it's dried, and then it gets cut up and extruded into these little pieces. And so it needs to be rehydrated. To use it, you'd have to soak it in water, usually about 10, 15 minutes or so. And then you can start adding all of your flavors and then cook it as if you were cooking some kind of meat or something in a frying pan or whatever. You can use it in various products, lasagna, tacos, that sort of stuff. So because it's soya, it's going to be very high in protein. It's going to taste very bland unless you put a lot of flavoring into it. And this is where the ingredients that we talked about earlier, the umami ingredients, really come into play. Now, TVP, textured vegetable protein, I think is what that stands for, is generally made from soya. So it's a byproduct of the vegetable oil industry. And so the oil, once it's extracted from whatever bean it is, let's talk about soya. So it's extracted from soya, and basically then you're just left with really soya flour at that point. And soya, so that's the fat that's been denatured or taken out of the soya flour, most of the fat. So then that fat, by the way, gets mostly removed by the use of solvents and high temperatures. Just to be aware of that. That's how that gets extruded. But you're left with the soy flour. In that soy flour is very little impact from the solvents that were used. So there are lots of tests that have gone on about that. And there's no real risk there from a human health perspective. But basically, you're left with this processed bit of soya which then gets formulated in heat into chunks, and then it gets extruded into pieces. So the pieces themselves are going to be very light and spongy inside once they go through their extruder, which heats them, and then they're immediately exposed to colder air, which creates this puffing up, usually around 3 times the size, and that's what creates that sort of sponginess inside. So they function almost identical to a soy curl in that you have to rehydrate them and then cook them. And if you don't add any flavoring to them, you're going to be really disappointed in the flavor because there won't be much flavor. It'll be very bland, and you'll wonder, why did I do this? But if you do add a lot of umami to it, they certainly aren't bad in certain isolated situations. I would say overall, I have used them. I'm not hugely impressed with TVP. I think there's other things that you can use that are better. For instance, okara comes to mind. Okara is what's left over from soya milk pressing. So the soya beans that are pressed to create soya milk, what's left behind, that meaty substance that's left behind, is called okara. It's very common. You can buy it in almost any Japanese store. And you can just cook that the same way that you would cook these TVP products, and you would have a lot more protein in that particular product than you would using something that's TVP.
Would you say this goes the same for soy crumbles as well?
Yeah, soy crumbles are in essence TVP.
Right. Okay.
So it's basically it's just different names to them depending on where you are in the world. So I forget what they're even called here in the German side, but it's very easy to find them in any sort of health food store. And I use that term, health food store, rather liberally.
So you wouldn't say it's whole food. It's certainly not on, these things aren't on that. They're not making us healthier, but they're not necessarily...
Jeff, I try to stay away from that term whole food because really, the only thing that's whole food is like an apple, right? There's nothing that's going to get done to it, right? And so I like to look at these products and say, okay, which one is going to be better? So Soy Curls has nothing added to it and nothing taken away from it. So in essence, that's going to be closer to the concept of whole food than TVP, which has gone through a process where the fat has been removed from the soya and then it's processed into a flour before it's extruded. So that's going to have something added to it in the sense of solvents and something taken out in the sense of fats. And so there the alarm bells would go off, and I'd want to look into that product a little bit more before saying whether I would use it or not.
Okay.
But there's people talk about whole food, non-processed whole foods all the time in terms of diets. But it's very rare. The minute you cut into an onion, you've already processed the onion, right, to some degree. So it's very rare to come across anything that hasn't had some degree of processing. But it's also very difficult to find something that's really 100% whole food. You can, unless of course you're eating something raw, in its natural state.
But these things aren't necessarily bad for you. But just keep an eye on the ingredients. Some of them may be over-processed, but in general. Yeah.
I would say the soy curls are better than the other products. But, it's the kind of thing that everybody's got to decide for themselves. But from my perspective, I would say minimal amounts is probably better than a mainstay of your diet. I wouldn't use them every day.
Okay. We've got another question from Lisa. Who's asking, there are so many different types of vegan meat alternatives, and it's often easy to use these alternatives when cooking for a mixed crowd or for a family when you're tired and need a quick meal. So could you recommend specific options for a quick, easy, OMS-friendly meat alternative meal?
Are we talking about stuff that you buy that's convenient?
I think it's the convenience, isn't it? I think she just wants. She's saying if she's tired, needs a quick meal, feeding the family. What would be a good meat alternative to put in?
Yeah, and I really sympathize with someone that finds himself in this position. That's not me, but I certainly understand that that's not a simple situation to be in. You're working all day, you're tired, maybe you have a little bit of an MS flare, you have kids to feed, and you come home and you have to make something. What do you do? It is tempting to go to the supermarket and to buy something off the shelf and put it on the stove and heat it up, or put it in the oven and heat it up, and there you go. That is terribly convenient, and that's exactly what the food industry wants us to do. So I think rather than taking that approach, I think it's much better to invest a little bit more time earlier in the week and make a plan, to sort of plan out a little bit. What am I going to do about food this next week? Get some help in the kitchen, if you have kids, get them to start chopping vegetables, get them involved to help put things together on the weekend or towards the end of the week that you can freeze or that will keep in the refrigerator for a little bit of time. And so those are the things that I would tend to go with. You can certainly make vegetable curries that are delicious and incorporate things like tofu or some of the other things that we had talked about today that go in and create this sort of meatiness in a curry. Something served with rice or something, that's going to please anybody, whether you're vegan or not. You're going to be happy with that kind of dish. I think making something like, like a big bowl of beans, like a chili or something like this, you can make it in large portions. And like you said earlier, it doesn't cost anything to make 12 portions. It doesn't cost more than making, 4 portions or something. So you might as well make enough that you can either freeze a portion for later or, just eat during the week, maybe change it up a little bit and just add some different vegetables in it. Lasagna is another thing. It's so easy to make a lasagna. And really all you need is a good tomato sauce. You need some good vegetables. Prepare those ahead of time. You just go buy the pasta sheets, dried pasta sheets that don't have an egg in them. They're very easy to buy. You don't need to pre-cook the pasta, which is great. And you just build a large lasagna, adding some of the things that we talked about earlier in terms of building those flavors, using vegetables that are going to be meaty in nature, like eggplant or mushrooms or something of this nature, putting something together. And boy, that lasagna will, I guarantee you, it will be hard to keep it around much more than a couple of days because it's going to taste really good. You do need to know how to make a very good bechamel. That's key because a lasagna is very creamy, but that's very simple to learn. I think things like a shepherd's pie, is very simple to do using mashed potatoes and a whole host of different vegetables. You can, if you want, incorporate some of these easier meat replacement things like soy curls or okara, like we talked about earlier, into those vegetables, but don't make it the main star. Just have it in addition to a lot of the other vegetables that are there. You can make like a bolognese, very simple to make, a big portion. You can can it very easily, so you always have it on hand. Really doesn't take a lot of effort to come home and unscrew a jar of pre-made tomato or bolognese sauce and make a round of pasta for everybody. That's always going to be a pleaser. Always going to be a pleaser.
You mentioned, there's a couple I wanted to raise it. You mentioned firstly curry. So if we're looking quick and easy, one thing we mentioned frozen, but that I like to have things frozen out. They are sort of that emergency. We just need to eat quickly, low effort meal. But actually, curry's really, really quick. The way we look at onion. So the base is really just starting off with onion. It's going to have curry spices, which are pre-mixed in a tub. Like, I don't bother, yes, you could go and say, okay, I'm going to grind my own spices and mix them up. Absolutely, you could do. I'm sure you do that, but I buy
Guilty
it
as charged.
pre-made and say this is a tikka flavoured one. It has the mix already, and that's what it has in it, spices. And it's going to have chickpeas. It's going to have spinach. And it's going to have tomato, passata, like sieve tomato. I don't think much else goes in there really. And
maybe you can do some roasted eggplant or something. I mean, you can always add different things.
Yeah, you can add different things, but the stuff I've put in there, that's taken me 5-10 minutes maximum. It doesn't take as long as the rice takes to cook the sauce. And the chickpeas give it a bit of chew to it and some protein. And I mean, I'm talking tinned chickpeas here. I mean, obviously, otherwise you have to soak them, but that's a quick meal. And another one that I like is pasta you mentioned, an arrabbiata type sauce where literally we put in onion, garlic, again, sort of sieved tomatoes, passata, chili. So some fresh chili goes in there, and then some vegetables. So we tend to do it with some broccoli in there, with some fresh broccoli. And then just with spaghetti. And again, it really doesn't take much longer to cook than the spaghetti takes.
That's right.
And that's a quick and easy meal. So so the third point, I personally find the effort on an MS standpoint is the chopping. So because of cooking more with fresh ingredients, there's more chopping involved. And a lot of chopping, I start to find my hands get really tired. And so there's two things I like to do. One is do that at lunchtime and put it in the fridge. So I've got my chopped stuff all ready to go. And the second thing is there's these things, I don't know what the proper term with it. Bizarrely, we call it a choppy chop, but I know that's not its proper term. It's a cylindrical sort of device with blades inside it, which has a pull cord, which causes the blades inside to spin very, very quickly. And it's very, very easy to use it to chop up things like onions. It's not something where you really want to get a precise, I need these things to be an inch long. That's not going to do that. It's going to finely chop whatever you put in it. Works very well for onions, works very well for mushrooms. So anything takes a lot of chopping. You can reduce the effort with devices.
That's right. That's right. I mean, in any soup or stew or even a pasta sauce or something, you're always going to be starting with something that's, I'll use the Italian term, like a sofrito, which is basically carrots, onions, celery, and it needs to be chopped up. But there's no rule that says you have to use a knife. I mean, you can chuck it all into a food processor and just pulse it a few times and chop it up a little bit. That's perfectly okay, and that's going to work great. And it'll take, literally seconds to make that, as opposed to, working on your knife skills.
Although I would say from
nothing against that.
No, my brother was a chef, and so I would say he bought us a set of proper chef's knives as a wedding present. And I would say a high quality knife that's kept sharp is so much better and so much easier to use. Yes, you can cut yourself if you're not careful, but yeah,
it's much safer. I have high quality Japanese knives that I use that are just razor sharp. The test that we always like to do is holding up a piece of paper in front of you and just actually slicing it without any effort. Yeah, it goes right through the paper, which is great because it requires no effort to cut anything.
And another question, you've mentioned bolognese. So Nicola from Canterbury in the UK has a question about bolognese. She wants your best advice for a good ragu. She uses red, green, and brown lentils, but others suggest finely chopped mushrooms or crumbled tofu. What are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts are, it sounds good. What time is dinner?
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't need to be much more than that. I think that sounds fantastic. So a real true bolognese is basically going to be the classic bolognese is going to be carrots, onions, garlic, celery, all sweated a little bit. By sweating, that means basically just in a pan over relatively low heat and just kind of stewing in their own vegetables until they get soft. So the traditional one then will have chunks of meat, not ground beef or ground meat. It'll have chunks of meat and then it's cooked in a meat broth, and it's basically at the end, sometimes it's finished with a little bit of butter or cream, but that's an optional thing. What people find fascinating, a true bolognese actually doesn't have tomato in it.
I was going to say, you didn't mention tomato.
Yeah. a true doesn't have tomato in it if you go to Bologna and you're in Italy. Now, I recognize most of the world doesn't know that, and most of the world thinks that a bolognese or a ragu has tomato in it, which is fine. You can do that. It's just a different kind of sauce, but that's fine. You can use the same sort of technique. So instead of meat, in this particular case, you do these vegetables, but then you can work in some of the things that we talked about, the jackfruit, lentils, mushrooms, okara, soy curls if you want to, those sorts of things. What I would suggest is cooking that protein element separate and introducing a good amount of these umami type flavors we discussed earlier into those elements. Once they're cooked, then putting them into the sauce and just finishing it. I think that gives you a better overall finish than if you tried to cook it all together and add those like soy sauce into the tomato-based sauce. It just doesn't come out the same. I think you can control the flavors much more if you cook that element separately and then work it into the sauce. And make a big portion because you can freeze it or can it later.
So finally, I know you've been a vegan for a long while, so meat has not been anywhere near your radar. When one makes a health-based or ethical choice to forego meat, do you think it's a good idea to even find substitutes that taste similar, or just leave it behind and explore the bountiful world of other delicious options that are nowhere near the same flavour profile? So do we actually think ultimately we shouldn't be looking to replace the meat? We should actually just be looking for a whole range of different delicious foods and not even think about it needs an alternative.
Yeah, it's an excellent question to ponder, Jeff. There are many kind of approaches I've heard that people take when first starting out on a plant-based diet or within the OMS community. Personally, I think it could be a mistake to rely too much on the meat replacement options at the outset. I think it's important to understand the role that meat played in your life previously. Review maybe some of your favorite list of recipes from that time frame and figure out ways to sort of replicate the flavor profile without relying on meat replacers. So that's putting the onus right back onto everybody out there, all our listeners. It's really up to everybody to just say, I don't really need these meat replacers in my life. There are plenty of other ingredients that are out there that I can explore. And as long as I learn a few things, how to season something, how to put some additional flavor in, how to change textures, then, I can really move a great deal further and I can get beyond some of the meat replacers. I just think that, and I've seen this so much, I think people tend to take the path of least resistance. And for example, in the vegan baking world, I just get so frustrated when I just look at these recipes that are developed, and almost everybody is using, just the easiest kind of solution to figure out how to replace butter in a pastry dough, right? And so they turn to coconut fat, or they turn to vegan butter, which is essentially just margarine, and they just go from there. And there are just other ways to do it, and it just requires a little bit more effort to figure that out. And I think the same thing applies in replacing meats. I think it's extremely simple to heat something up that is basically a convenience food. That's not a problem. It may even taste amazing with exactly the same texture as meat. And unfortunately, it just doesn't do anything to benefit your health. And for us, I think that should be a primary consideration. So, but having said that, I also think there's some room for people to just work slowly into transition. I think there's some room out there to utilize some of these ingredients, especially if they're lower in sodium, lower in saturated fat, don't have a lot of binders or emulsifiers. And I think you can use them wisely at specific times, not necessarily even for convenience, but to please other people. Maybe you're having a dinner party. Not everybody there is going to be following the same diet as you, but you want to serve something that's going to be generally familiar to most people. And I think that that's a good place to begin, to think about that. To do it every day, I would recommend staying away from that. Like I think I mentioned this earlier, it's not a meat replacement diet we're on. It's using strategically some meat replacers that are generally healthy, or to use these meat replacers strategically to create meals that are familiar and comforting to other people, but also to ourselves sometimes. And I think that that's okay, as long as it's done minimally and as long as it's done with using ingredients that are not necessarily going to be unhealthy.
Okay, with that, thank you very much for another illuminating episode, Jack. And I look forward to having you back in the hot seat for more questions on the next episode of Ask Jack, which will premiere on July the 6th.
Thanks, Jeff. In closing, I encourage people to maybe think about breaking the reliance on commercially prepared and heavily processed foods as much as possible. In other words, just encourage people to learn how to cook for themselves a little bit more, and certainly how to purchase more ingredients. The world is very large and broad when it comes to the options that are available. And I think it just requires just a little bit of effort there. It's also sort of, this whole meat replacement business is a very fluid environment right now. There's just billions of dollars being poured into creating new foods, in essence. And I think it's worth keeping an eye on for sure, but a wary eye. And I think it's important to not necessarily just jump right back into the same sort of habits that maybe got us into a health situation in the first place, meaning too much reliance on things that are convenient and unhealthy for us.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Ask Jack. Please check out this episode's show notes at overcomingms.org/podcast, where you'll find all sorts of useful links and bonus information. If you'd like to submit a question for a future episode of Ask Jack, please email us at podcast@overcomingms.org. You can also subscribe to Living Well with MS on your favourite podcast platform, so you never miss an episode of any of our podcasts. Ask Jack is kindly supported by a grant from the Happy Charitable Trust. If you'd like to support the Overcoming MS charity and help keep our podcast advertising free, you can donate online at overcomingms.org/donate. To learn more about Overcoming MS and its array of free content and programs, including webinars, recipes, exercise guides, OMS circles, our global network of community support groups, and more, please visit our website at overcomingms.org. While you're there, don't forget to register for our monthly e-newsletter so you can stay informed about the podcast and other news and updates from Overcoming MS. Thanks again for tuning in, and see you next time. The Living Well with MS family of podcasts is for private, non-commercial use and exists to educate and inspire our community of listeners. We do not offer medical advice. For medical advice, please contact your doctor or other licensed healthcare professional. Our guests are carefully selected, but all opinions they express are solely their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of the Overcoming MS charity, its affiliates, or staff.